This is the English Suite Podcast, the voice of Widener University English and Creative Writing, hosted by Jim Ash.
In today's episode, I talk with Jon-Michael Frank, a comic artist and writer. Jon-Michael Frank is the author of several books, including How's Everything Going? Not Good. Here it is, my beautiful fucking heart. Is this the right color to prove I don't have a shitty life? Dark Garbage, a graphic novel. Things to Do Instead of Killing Yourself, a collaboration with Tara Booth. And the chapbook Nostalgia Flower. He is the illustrator for Samson Starkweather's Pain, the board game, and has had comics appear in Blunderbuss, Nailed Magazine, and Psychology Today. He lives in Austin, Texas. Jon-Michael Frank writes comics about the complex difficulties in daily life. And he writes about these with dark humor, biting irony, and authentic insight. He has cultivated a massive audience on Instagram, comprising tens of thousands of followers. In November 2020, I had the opportunity to chat with Jon-Michael about his career. A little backstory is needed to explain how he got here. Back in spring 2020, a high school friend, Dave Blank, and I launched a new podcast called Tabula Rasa. On many episodes of the first season, we explored the life and influence of one Tom Williams, a beloved creative writing teacher at Marple Newtown Senior High School, our alma mater. Tom passed away in 2010, but his legacy is deep and wide. As word of Tabula Rasa spread, more and more of Tom's colleagues and former students approached us to pay tribute to him on the podcast, including Jon-Michael Frank. In this follow-up interview, you will hear occasional references to Tom Williams, but the primary focus of this interview is on Jon-Michael's career. Before we turn to my conversation with Jon-Michael Frank, I'd like to speak with one of our Widener alumni, Victoria Gensante, who is a follower of Jon-Michael Frank on Instagram, where a lot of his comic art shows up. I was curious to hear from Victoria, what is the appeal of his art, and what do you think he does that's special compared to other comic artists? Victoria, what class were you from? Was it 2020?
2018.
2018. Oh, wow. Yeah. 2 years off. Not even close.
Yeah.
So Victoria, you were an English major, correct? And now you're in grad school?
Yep. I am in my third year at Rosemont. I'm doing a double degree. So I'm getting my MFA in creative writing and then my MA in publishing.
Awesome. And I noticed that on Instagram, you were a follower of Jon-Michael Frank. So I wanted to talk to you about that. How did you sort of discover this guy, and what is it that what draws you to his comic art?
How I discovered him. So I've been following a few comic artists lately, specifically people like Pants and Lord Birthday are two of my absolute favorites. And sometimes when I'm looking for new things, new artists to follow, I kind of go through the Discover page on Instagram. And one day I had found one of Jon-Michael Frank's comics, and it resonated with me so deeply. It was just a single panel comic about like idealization of oneself and like of interpersonal relationships, and I was like, wow, this feels very real. So I checked out his page, and it was an instant follow. So I've been kind of watching his comics evolve over time, and now he's getting into these stories, these multi-panel stories that just make me feel things that most comic artists aren't able to do. And I think it's super incredible. I'm just so drawn to his self-awareness and the self-actualization of really complex feelings that a lot of people don't even realize that is going on. Yeah, that was really the big thing.
There's sort of a brutal honesty to his work and
Yeah.
a lot of dark humor, but I've it like stings, but
It stings, but
it makes me laugh at the same time.
exactly. It's kind of, sometimes it's silly, but and I feel like it's also, the art style, sometimes I feel like a little scribble person, but it makes this like really deep, serious, like emotional realization feel a little bit lighter. And his ability to poke fun at these like really hard things to realize about yourself. I mean, we all really want to be perfect people, and we're not ever. So it's really interesting to kind of follow, his personal journey on developing into, whatever kind of person he's on the road to developing into. We're always, works in progress. It's kind of what it is to be a human. And I feel like, being a human is hard. Existing is really hard. And, these comics, though they seem lighthearted, they're just so real, and it kind of shows like a much darker, deeper truth behind almost everything that we do and think.
And now let's turn to our interview with Jon-Michael Frank. I began this interview by asking Jon-Michael to tell the story of his journey from creative writing class with Tom Williams at Marple Newtown High School to what he is doing now.
Yeah, I was doing haiku in high school and writing in high school, just have no music talent at all. So I was like, basically got kind of ushered into poetry reluctantly, maybe, I don't know, maybe not reluctantly, but I feel like it's sort of I think for writing, there's a split thing for maybe a lot of people. If you have musical talent, then you become a songwriter. And if not, you're like stuck writing poems for the rest of your life, maybe. Yeah, so just kind of writing off and on after high school. And yeah, I mean, after high school, I took like basically a year off and moved up to upstate New York and was dealing with a lot of like life and mental conflict stuff, and just sort of felt like I watched TV for about a year, kind of recuperating from some of the damage that I caused in my life. And then I guess towards the tail end of that, I sort of picked up writing a little bit again. I think the person I was dating at the time sort of kind of like sat me down and was like, you don't really have a future and you probably should work on that. So that kind of gave me a little push to maybe go back to writing again. And I actually wrote some poems I think I sent to Tom, and he wrote this like cryptic response. I think it was something like Dawn of the Poetic Dead, which I still don't have any idea what that means, but felt sort of like flippant and sarcastic.
He did that. He did that with us a little bit when I had this songwriting partner, Jim Morris, and we were making tapes in his basement. So we sent Tom one of our tapes, and this was, I think, after we were out of high school, and then he wrote these cryptic messages on index cards for every song on the tape.
Oh wow!
And one of them he identified as the hit.
Yeah.
So he just drew money bags on the index card. But yeah, they were pretty funny too.
I'm sure. Did that feel encouraging to you or defeating?
Encouraging, yeah, totally. It was just any kind of attention was great.
Right.
Like, right. So, but what about in your case?
I think it was the opposite to a degree. Yeah, I didn't really understand. I mean, Dawn of the Poetic Dead, maybe I'm misremembering that quote. You know how memory, I'm actually reading, I don't know if you know W.G. Sebald, if you're familiar with his writing at all.
I'm not sure.
He's a German author. In the 90s, he wrote 4 or 5 books that they're sort of these all kind of blurring autobiographical sort of ramblings about memory, and he kind of walks you through a city. He's fantastic, but a lot of it about memory kind of making itself up, and the brain kind of plugging in Lego pieces to account for how it is today, and sometimes those being accurate and sometimes not. So anyway, yeah, if that's what the quote was, Dawn of the Poetic Dead doesn't sound very like whatever. But I'm like insecure and such. So, but yeah, after high school, I did that, and then I moved back to kind of the Philadelphia area and kind of meandered around reading a lot and was pretty lost. I didn't really have like a big artist community, I guess, and I have a little bit more now, but that's definitely something I struggle with in my life. But I sort of just I was going to like community college, and yeah, I just started I started writing more seriously, and I just, I didn't have a big social thing. I was like struggling pretty hard with alcoholism and stuff. And I just knew it was kind of like my ticket out of that sort of life that I was going down. So I went to a 2-year college in Boston, and I went for English, to teach English, and I'm sure that was inspired by Tom, actually. But there was some confusion a little bit over that. And so I took a few classes that were like I took like one poetry class, maybe one workshop, and a bunch of fiction classes. So I kind of wanted exposure to like writing world and kind of see how I fared in that world and if I was any good, and also be able to like do something more concrete and like, more of a career, or like to make money by getting a teaching degree or whatever. So anyway, long story short, I did that and started writing more poetry and fiction and stuff. And after that, I moved back to Pennsylvania to start the haiku journal with Tom that went on for about a year or two. And so that was kind of a big motivating factor for moving back. But then he passed away, I think like a year in when we were doing that. And at that point, I was like, I didn't want to be in Philadelphia anyway. So I moved to Austin and got a part of the local poetry or more modern poetry scene here. I was pretty skeptical and kind of disheartened by modern poetry. I didn't quite understand it or whatever. And so I started working for this press that I loved everything that they put out. And I started, really connecting with modern poetry, and I did a reading series in Austin, and it was a big part of that, and writing poetry every day. Yeah, when I moved back to Austin or moved back to Philly, I got sober that, and that really, I think, was a big kind of key in the ignition for me. And I started writing every day, and I really struggled with discipline and work ethic, and I don't know, something kind of clicked, I guess, when I was like 27, and I just was like, I'm going to write a poem every day to make this book. And I did that, and it finally happened, and sort of rode on the wave of that meaning and purpose of sort of an everyday discipline. And it was everything. I was working overnight shifts at a restaurant, and then I was writing poems as soon as I woke up, and that was my day. And it was like, as long as I got a poem out, like, didn't matter what the rest of the day was like, because I had already fulfilled whatever I thought purpose was. And so I assembled this book of poems that I had high hopes for, and it really kind of crashed and burned. It wasn't really received great, and I thought it'd be published and all this stuff, and it was really hard getting that rejection. It was pretty dark. And so in response to sort of writing, I was writing. Actually, that book, a lot of it had to do with Tom being dead. He was like sort of this character I'd wrote in this book.
Well, what's the title of the book?
It's like kind of called The Wheelbarrow Poems. It's changed a bunch. I mean, the book, I haven't really seen it in a long time, but I was dealing with kind of a Tom death and one bad date I went on. And my sister at the time, I guess around that time, was addicted to heroin, and it was about that too. So it was like very heavy stuff in my life. And so I started making comics in response to like writing this poetry that was like really just kind of meaty and glum and, difficult. And so I just was like, I need something kind of like silly, even though like the comics were also dark, but I just wanted to work in a different discipline. And a friend of mine named Christina had showed me this comic artist stuff when I was staying with her, and that really kind of inspired me. I was like, oh, I could do that. So I just started making comics. I was probably like 27 or 28, experimenting with that.
So when you, if I understand this story right, like you sort of made a turn from this creative writing, which was kind of getting too heavy and dark, and then you turn to art, which seemed to be more maybe direct, and I don't know how you would describe it, but kind of like fundamental or um, less pretentious, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah.
If that's a way to put it.
Yeah, for sure.
But and then how did you have some early success with it? Like where did this art find its place? Like did you start sending it out places and getting it published, or how did you find your audience for it?
Yeah, I was just like making comics and showing to my friends for a while, and then like I said, I was waiting tables, and there was this guy that I worked with who suggested I take my comics to this store in town in Austin called Parts and Labor. And I think actually my ex at the time brought it in. I don't think she brought it in. I didn't even bring it in. And so she brought my originals in there, and they were like, these are funny, but like we need prints and do this. And so the owner of the store, Lizelle, was so gracious and welcoming, and kind of like, told me to like go get prints in this local print store. And then so I made some prints, and they started selling decently in the store. And that in itself was like a stroke of luck. And then so once I learned that, then I learned how to play the store game and reaching out to stores and submitting. And so I did that. And then my ex at the time made an Instagram for me. I wasn't on social media or anything like that. Just I guess building from there and just making a ton of work. I mean, I used to make one-page comics, and I talked about this in a workshop I did where I used the same comics just were easy and natural in some way. Work or writing is just like it's not very much fun. Like it's work. It's like endless work, and I really wanted to just kind of let go of that. And so I work better with quantity rather than quality because none of my ideas are that great. So it's easier for me to pump out like 50 ideas than it is for me to like refine one idea. And so comics really, or just one page thing, haiku comics really supported that need of mine and supported that quote unquote skill that I have. Tom taught me that in high school, sitting down and writing 30, 40 haiku, just banging them out. And that's exactly how I write comics now is I had a blank book, and then I would say every day I make 40 comics, and I just go, and most of them are bad. But my brain's really that's, I guess, one thing, my brain's really quick in that way. And I can work, if I'm not thinking, quote unquote, then my work is like better. And so comics, like you said, of it being unpretentious, like in not having to think in these sort of, when I would write, I was always trying to write these aphorisms and these great lines and sort of this like, what's that physics term? I think it's called gut, where it's a grand unifying theory. Is that what it is?
Yeah, I think so.
Is that what it is? Yeah. I think that same sort of mentality of like, writers writing these aphorisms of these grand unifying theories. And so it took me some time to break out of that, I think, into.
Do your comics start with the text? Because writing still plays a huge role in your art. I mean, it's a merging of text and visual.
Yeah.
So does it start with the visual image, or does it start with the caption or the haiku or whatever text is?
It's all writing based. Like we're working on a comic right this morning, and it's all I used Word Doc for everything. I just start for the longer stuff that I've been doing, which I've kind of switched to, where it's like 10 panels. I write it all out, whereas sort of the one pagers in my book, I mean, it's still based on writing, but I just take a page and I break it up into 9 panels, and then each one I'll just like draw a very rough image that really doesn't matter, and just whatever the words come to my mind. But yeah, I would say it's all writing based. With comic stuff, I think there's this press called Cold Cube Press from Seattle, and I'm friends with one of the guys who runs it named Aiden. I think I met him at this comic festival in Seattle, and he said something once of like, drawing's the easy part, like writing's the hard part. And that's so true. And in any medium, writing is the hardest part. So that probably lends to like my crappy art where it's like I can get away because the emphasis really is on the writing. And I kind of use the images, I think, kind of just as like tricking people into reading the work, to be honest, because, if you got rid of the images or the bad drawings and it was just writing, it would be okay, but it's like not the same paired that way. And so it's like kind of, I always feel like I'm cheating people kind of into reading my writing or poetry. And so I have this kind of complex that I failed in the poetry world. And so now I'm like kind of like sneaking it and scamming the system.
Subversive.
Yeah.
It's great though. I mean, and I'm looking at your Instagram page. You've got over 76,000 followers. I mean, how did that happen? That's amazing that you found this audience. They found you. How did that grow? And I'm also curious about like the kind of feedback that you get from people I think your art is perfect for Instagram, by the way.
Yeah.
I mean, the one panel, and even like when you do the stories, like it's like a perfect marriage of medium and message in a way. But I'm just curious how did this kind of just balloon suddenly, or was it a slow growth? Or
I mean, I think early on, like I said, my ex kind of created my Instagram and just kind of, I don't know, focused on Austin and would like people's stuff that I like. I did a lot of interacting with that. I don't really do that anymore, but I think the early stages was like interacting online. Yeah, I mean, this year it's like really changed. The audience has grown this year a lot, and I think a lot of that has to do with COVID. And a lot of it's algorithms based, and you can clearly see like, artists or anyone who has like a following on there, like it's very much part of the machine of social media. You can look at that stuff and be like, yeah, you grow this audience and stuff. And, obviously people respond to the art and stuff like that. But so much of that stuff is the algorithm and social media based. And so I have obviously a complicated, relationship to that and sort of my opinion of that. So a lot of it has to do with luck. And, obviously I think some people respond to the work and stuff like that, but to a degree, it's like anything else where these structures are in place and somehow you just fit into them and somehow you don't. And, and it's also like, I make a ton of work, and I have like endless content. I have like just books full of unused ideas. And, I've really focused on that for the past couple years, and that's great in a lot of ways, but my real life has suffered because of it for sure, in my social life and love life and stuff. So that amount of content is great and it's really fulfilling to me, but I think it's getting somewhat to a point where I don't really want that to be all of my life. I live alone, and I just kind of live in the 1-bedroom studio or whatever, and a lot of my days I'm kind of making work or whatever, and especially now different with COVID, not being able to go out and socialize, but it's kind of a trade-off, or as Tom would say, there's a double-edged sword quality.
You're making a living at this, right? This is what you're doing full time?
Yeah. Like I said, I got really fortunate about that store early on. And so I taught 1 year of high school when I was 30, and that was fine. Didn't go great, didn't love it. But then there was just 1 month where I got a check from that store that basically was paying my rent. And I was like, oh, so I just kind of saved my money from teaching high school for a year. I made more money than I'd ever made in my life. And then I just saved a quarter of it, I think, or more. And so I was like, I'm going to kind of try to ride this wave a little bit and try not to work anymore. And then, so now I make a living, and I'm, I feel blessed and lucky for that. And it's also a lot of work too, but,
I think what strikes me about your work, and I'm not great about talking about work, there's just brutal honesty to it. to your comics, like, so, and it's like very sort of dark humor, right? But there's humor there, and like I laugh and I cringe at some of this, and like I see so much of myself in some of these comics, and it's like this sort of shock of recognition, right? And I'm just wondering if you hear that from a lot of your followers, that they kind of respond to the work in that way.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's definitely the comments I receive and stuff like that, and people. It's
like this artwork that sort of has this sort of childlike quality to it, right? But it's wedded to this sort of dark existentialist awareness, right? And that's I think part of the charm of it is that sort of almost like a paradoxical relationship between the images and the text.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I mean, I think I think that there's something that's like super resonating about, as you said, childlike stuff, you know, because I feel like, I don't know about you, but I feel like most people feel like children their whole life. So, you know, I think that's, I don't know, I think that's such an important reminder.
Well, in the Padula Rasa interview with Dave, you talked about the teenage heart, and that really resonated with me.
Yeah. Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
Yeah, because I don't think. Well, there's this Tom Waits song that goes like, "I don't want to grow up." That's me. Like I don't.
Yeah.
I'm 56 years old, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up.
Yeah.
I'm still figuring that out. But why do we have to shed that, right?
Shed what?
Our teenage heart.
Oh, yeah. Well, we don't. But
why deny it? I mean, it's there anyway, right?
I mean, it's, you know, not to be corny, but the Shakespeare's "All the World's a Stage" kind of thing, which I've thought about my life and always was like, I don't get it. I always thought that quote was really stupid, but and maybe it kind of is. But the end of I don't know if you ever seen My Dinner with Andre.
One of my favorite films.
Yeah, that's a classic. Well, the movie ends with this idea where they're talking about, I mean, the whole thing is about playing roles. You know, they're two actors having a conversation talking about roles, and then they're talking about the roles we play in real life. And there's just this biting ending where I kind of forget, but it's something like, you know, what's a mother, what's a son, what's a father, like all, you know, these things change, you know, yeah, it's just this, you really think about it, the framework of how sinister this idea of roles are, even to think of oneself as a father or think of oneself as an adult, you know, there are all these interfaces and fences trying to get between us and what we're supposed to be or something, or drive us to what we're quote unquote supposed to be. And we forget that we aren't any of these things and they have literally no meaning. You know, they might be helpful to be like, oh, I'm a father, so I should care about my child. Okay, that's helpful, but that's helpful in, I think, an external way. Yeah, I don't think that's really helpful to think of oneself as a father internally.
He has definitely carved out a genre in the comic world for sure. I don't quite know anybody who tackles these kind of like inner thought processes the way that he does. But you know, his his style of art, those line drawings, those kind of crazy figures, that's a really popular style right now. One that I'm a big fan of. So he does fit into that kind of world. There's Pants and Lord Birthday, who are really massive comic artists on Instagram right now, who also kind of use that line style, who have some darker tones to their art, but manage to kind of keep it a little lighter and poetic and bring in some humor in there. But something about Jon-Michael Frank's like personal touch to everything that he does, he's sharing really deep, raw parts of himself with his followers in his art, and he does that in a way that I really haven't found in other artists of his style.
I often find when I read his comic panels that I see myself in them, right?
Yeah.
And that's hard to confess that, but it's like, oh yeah, that's the way he's talking about relationships or whatever. And it's like, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, and it's hard to accept it sometimes because he's talking about parts of ourselves that we just really want to block away. Like, we don't want to acknowledge that we can idealize another person, that we can block ourselves off from the real world with technology, that we aren't really just taking it all in the way that we should. And we don't want to acknowledge and accept those parts of ourselves as true, but they are, and they're inherently large, important parts of who we are. So, I mean, yeah, it hurts to see yourself in those comics, but I mean, I think it's just so interesting how all of these comics are so personal to him and his experience, but they still just are wildly universal. I feel like any critically thinking, like emotionally adept human being would be able to see themselves in these comics. I mean, we're not perfect, and sometimes the truth hurts, but we need to hear it.
Yeah, it's that shock of recognition, but it's like, it's also a shock of, it's like a connection.
Yeah, it's good
Right.
to know I'm not alone in these feelings and in these actions. Sometimes when I do have this self-actualization where, like, oh my gosh, like, I act this way, or I'm wasting my life thinking about these things when I could be doing something else. And then you start to kind of beat yourself up about it. And then it's just really, I mean, as hard as it is to read some of these comics, it really is just, it's helpful to know that this is something that, so many people resonate with and so many people are going through. And that's why he has such a big following. So it's comforting at the same time. There were things that I had never processed until I really started reading some of these comics. And I'm like, whoa, I need to like sit down and have a little talk with myself and figure some shit out. So yeah, I feel like his art has really, brought a lot of awareness to people about, things that they probably wouldn't have dealt with otherwise, now that all of us have the time to process and work on ourselves.
Another question I have for you, where you had this amazing interpretation of the slogan that Tom used to say, that the world is not the world.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, all those Tomisms, I hear them and they just, they're just like bricks dropping on your head. And I can hear him saying that. I can hear his intonation, just him stopping and waving his hand at you and being like, hey, remember, the world is not the world, and just dragging his finger through the air with command, yeah. So yeah, I thought about that, and it's classic Tom. And also, that's the thing that we were just talking about with roles. The world is not the world. It's so good. And it's definitely steeped in what he was into, haiku and Buddhism and all offshoots of sort of those Eastern practices and religions and Eastern thought. And so, yeah, a big haiku that he taught, and then I carry with me into this day. The world of do is the world of do, and yet, and yet. And that's such a big one. And so that idea of the world of do is the world of do, meaning the do is the ephemerality of the world, the world of do is the world of do. And then and yet is that's the meaning and the magic. It's like, yes, things end, but while they're going on, that magic, that foreverness in the ephemera of, if you have an experience with someone that lives with you forever, and even just maybe physics wise, of energy never really being lost, right? It just changes perhaps. And so it just seemed eerily, the world is not the world, seemed very eerily like the world of do is the world of do, and yet. So he could have found that verbatim from somewhere, which wouldn't surprise me, or he could have kind of hijacked it from, I think, that haiku. And so I think what he's saying is that the world is not the world is very similar to saying, the world's going to end, or things are going to end, but meaning, look beyond the world. And this idea of, you think of, I got to be a father, I got to go to this job, I got to do this. And, the world is just built with people who hate each other, and the world is that. And also the human microscope with which we look at the world. We never look at it from the perspective of an animal, or in the impossible perspective of the universe in general, which I don't know if the universe has its own perspective, but yeah, I think it's a good, that's the classic Tom thing of, and it's also kind of Plato in the cave, with the shadows and just parting the curtain, and the Wizard of Oz, and just and I connected with Tom over this, and I've struggled this in my life, and people would call me an idealist or romantic. I think it just serves so much purpose to look at the world and be like, this is one way we've made the world, but this is not how it has to be, and it isn't how it has to be. And so I do feel like it does serve a purpose to be like, we shouldn't be spending all our time making money to earn a living. That's an insane lifestyle. And have you ever seen that movie? I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but it's like Koyaanisqatsi. Yeah, here it is. Koyaanisqatsi.
Yeah, I can't pronounce it either. I think it's a Japanese word, isn't it? Or
I'm not sure.
I saw that in the movie theater when it came out, I think, like the Ritz in Philly or something.
What was your response to that? How did that make you feel?
That film?
Yeah.
It sort of blew me away. I'd seen nothing like it. I'm trying to remember. I just remember this kind of like unbroken sort of sequences. There wasn't a lot of like environmental imagery and like industry, and it's like sort of stuff was sort of time lapse, and but it's been like a long time since I've seen it. And there was like this Philip Glass soundtrack. I remember that. I think it was an experience. What did you think of it?
Yeah, I saw it like a year ago. I was there's a poet that I really admire who mentioned it. I was kind of taking this workshop thing sort of, and I had never seen it. And yeah, so what it is, it's shots of landscapes and like sweeping just the world and mountains, and then it's contrasted with the human world.
Right.
So it'll be like 5 minutes of just clouds and mountains, and then 5 minutes like very sped up of like New York City, everyone running around like ants and like going and doing all this stuff. And it's just so masterfully put together that, there's no words or dialogue or narration, but you get this, the feeling in me was just overwhelming anxiety, and just sort of, just looking at this, like we're living in a sick, it's a sick society. It's a sickness that we can't see because we're so indebted to the human perspective of what life is like. And so I think it's the same thing. The world is not the world, because it's like you're seeing natural life and whatever, and then you're just seeing this insane mental illness that's driving all of us, society, of doing all,
It reminds me of this scene in My Dinner with Andre where he's talking about how all these New Yorkers think they say they want to get out of New York, but then they built their own prison, like, or something to that effect. Like they're trapped in this, that they can't get out of it. It's
exactly that.
That's their world, right? But that's not the world.
Right, exactly. Yep.
You tend to do these one panel or maybe like 9, 10 panel comics, but then how did you get from that to going into a graphic novel, which is, I don't know, what, a couple hundred pages or?
The one that is out is called Dark Garbage, and I think it's 250 pages or so. Or no, I guess it's 200 pages. I was making these like one-page comics that were like kind of insincere and like dark and stuff. And a friend of mine who's an artist I really admire, who like makes very vulnerable comics about her life, which I think encouraged the stuff I'm making now of being like, oh, I can just be honest and be sincere. She kind of sort of encouraged me to like make other stuff, and that like through our conversations, like basically saying like, you have all these other interests and other stuff going on, you should just kind of make stuff with what with your interest in poetry and your interest in whatever else. And so I was also reading like these sort of weird fantasy comics about like kind of fantasy, some sci-fi. So the graphic novel I made is about a bodybuilder named Esther and her butterfly friend who lives in this like glass jar, so the butterfly can never really get out, and they just go on these like very absurd surrealist adventures and kind of run into these characters. And it's like, it's a mix between sort of like gimmicky kind of self-deprecating humor and then sort of more stuff I'm into, like myth and My Dinner with, I have a My Dinner with Andre joke in there. But in My Dinner with Andre, they quote the Bergman quote. I think it was just from Persona, ironically, which I asked Tom for a list of movies to recommend me. And one of the movies was Persona on there, the Bergman movie. And the quote is, I could always live in my work, but never in my life. And which is just such a big one. So it quotes that. I think the butterfly mentions it or something, but that's such
a mind-blowing movie, by the way.
Yeah, I need to rewatch it. That's actually on my list. I watched it a long time ago, and I don't think my brain was sort of supported enough to handle it. But have you seen Scenes from a Marriage, that series?
Yeah, that's
earth-shattering.
Wow. Yeah, I think we watched there's 2 cuts of that.
Right.
And I think we watched the full-length series, not the movie version that they cut it down.
Yeah, that's the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 6 episodes of an hour each, or it's like 1 2-hour 45-minute movie. But every line in that 6 hours is just a heart killer.
Yeah, I watched that with my wife, which was
that's fun.
Uncomfortable. So
I bet. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that's great.
But we both loved it, and we're still married, so we survived.
That's great. Yeah. Well, I think that there's such an enduring testament in a relationship, and this gets me in a lot of trouble, but the space and the ability to what am I trying to say? Encounter, or like watching that movie of difficult things in a relationship, and things that address your loneliness in the relationship or your dissatisfaction, like being able to do that with a person that you love and are committed to, I think is just it's just like an apex of human emotion and ability. It takes such maturity and it's such a deeper love to be able to breach that material together and talk about, realistically some of the stuff, that you may feel disconnected with in your relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But coming back to Persona, I still don't even really get that film. I mean, it's such a challenge, and it's but it's so riveting. And there's I don't know how long it's been since you've seen it, but there's that point about midway through where like the film like breaks apart, like she drops a glass or something, and then like the screen kind of shatters. And it's just like all kinds of just bizarre stuff that I just love in that film.
Sounds like kind of fourth wall stuff.
Yeah, and then there's that whole montage in the beginning, which is really experimental.
Well, no spoilers. I'm probably gonna watch it tonight now. So
cool. Yeah, I have the DVD, but I should watch it again.
Oh, terrific!
But yeah, I had one of our colleagues at Widener. He just retired. He was our poetry professor, and he was is a big Bergman fan, and he would show his classes Persona. And I think in that one scene where it's like this 13-minute scene where the two characters are facing off, and so you hear the dialogue, and you're just watching a person sort of listening, and then it reverses, and the same exact scene replays. I think his classes would erupt in rebellion at that point when they got to that point in the film. They just didn't.
Couldn't do it anymore.
They couldn't handle it. But
yeah,
I give him credit for showing it.
Yeah, that takes an audacity that I don't have. Showing people experimental stuff is something I truly struggle with.
So anyway, so on your graphic novel, it sounds like sort of an episodic type of plot.
Yeah.
Right. Is it?
Yeah.
How did you kind of bring it out to a conclusion? Does it have a shape that way?
Yeah. So it's like, once again, I was kind of, it's all short stories basically. So it'll be like 4 or 5, 6 pages, or there's a 20-page short story. So it's kind of broken up into 3 books. And it'll be a bunch of like very short stories. And then each book kind of ends up with kind of a 20-page longer story or a saga or whatever. So it was easy to do that way. And I was once again, like kind of cheating with my strengths of being like, I can do a bunch of different ideas if I'm doing a book of short stories rather than committing to one idea. I'm finishing a graphic novel right now called I Never Found You, about this birder who he's out birding and he finds a hand in the woods, and it's kind of this kind of wild story goes from there. And that's one idea. So it's my first time really committing to one idea through the whole thing. And I made a sequel to Dark Garbage, which is also short stories too. That took me like a year and a half or 2. I finished that, I guess, about last year. Yeah, my goal with that was, so I finished that book basically before Dark Garbage came out, so I couldn't get discouraged if no one liked Dark Garbage. I would already have the second one done. So that was my tactic on that. Each short story actually is broken up with a poem that's like very surreal and doesn't quite make any sense, but it's just sort of kind of creating a mood and texture to the world. And that's once again of me like finding a way to cheat poetry into different realms, which has been kind of fun for me. But the graphic novel I'm finishing now that about the bird watcher is my attempt, quote unquote, at more of a like mainstream kind of thing, even though it's not like that, but it doesn't have poetry or anything like that in it. and my Instagram stuff's like pretty mainstream, but it's important for me to like have different disciplines, and like I want to do different stuff. So I use sort of the Instagram stuff in that world of more mainstream stuff to support some of the weirder stuff that I want to do and I'm into. And I'm trying to use that to kind of launch more into the art comic world, since I can make a living doing that other stuff. But so I'm always kind of juggling a bunch of different projects and mind states together, which it keeps me busy, and it's good for my mind to stay away from my life a little bit.
Right. But I'm also hearing that you're sort of seeking to get some balance back between the work and the life, right? I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. yeah.
But that's it's just hugely respectful of like the way that you've been able to make this work for you. It's just really impressive.
Oh, thanks.
Impressive, right?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I've talked about this with people too, and once you like are making a living and have an audience, like you're incentivized to do this stuff. And so I hear a lot of these successful artists kind of talk about all the work they do, and it is a lot of work, but it's different once you have you have someone who's like excited about your stuff. It makes that transition a bit easier. But sort of what you were saying before, I wanted to like chime in on, and back to that Bergman quote. I think that's what I'm talking about. Is I do feel like since it's starting to happen where it's like work is becoming so much of my life that quote of like I could always live in my work and not in my life, it's starting to come true, and it's a bit unnerving, because there's such an element of control that you have in your work that you don't have in your life, and especially when I'm making somewhat autobiographical or comics about like relationships in life, like it's comforting to live in those spaces. That doesn't translate to real life, like I can get a comic out of a relationship problem and get something positive out of that, but like the relationship problem is still there waiting for me. There's no comic response to that one. Like,
yes, it really doesn't change your life, right? Is that a fair way to put it?
100%. And I thought it would, and it doesn't.
Right. It's like people who get published novels and things, and they think that their life's gonna change after that. Well, it will change probably if it's successful and so forth, but it's still the same you, waking up every morning and going to bed at night. And but it just sounds to me like you've found a way to kind of process your experience in this really productive and frankly entertaining way for your audience, that I think people can. There's such positivity to it that way, and just being able to kind of plug in, and like I said before, you sort of see yourself in these scenarios that you're writing, and that's I guess maybe that's why we do art, just to make those kind of connections, or you put it out there with the hope that it's going to land on someone and speak to them.
Yeah, it's all about connection.
For more information about Jon-Michael Frank, visit his website, jonmichaelfrank.com, or follow him on Instagram at @JONMichaelFrank. The English Read podcast is produced by Jim Esch with assistance from Sienna Bowers, Chloe D. Flumeri, Shapressa Yimraj, and Matt Lomas. The piano piece, Gymnopede 1 by Eric Satie, was performed and recorded by Jim Esch. The English Suite is available at Anchor.fm, the Widener English YouTube channel, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast apps. You can send feedback to widenerenglishsuite@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.